Hey guys, welcome to my beginner Python tutorials. I'm going to try to keep the videos between 5 and 15 minutes because I want to get straight to the point, explain what it is exactly that you can expect from the topic that I'm going over, and then just go kind of experiment on your own. I don't want to get too crazy with like underlying mechanics of how it may or may not work, just because that could be a little too in depth for just kind of getting into programming initially. And I think if you can just kind of know what things do versus why things are, it'll be much more functional as you start. When you are a little bit more experienced with it, then you can start going into the whys, and then it'll really push your understanding of the language further. This video is about classes. What I'm gonna do is show you what happens when I do certain things. I'm not really going to explain a whole lot or even go too much into why that is like that. There's a few things that make classes really nice, and one of the biggest things that I think for a beginner to use it for is to share variables between your functions. Normally, if you want to use a variable between functions, you need to return it or send it in or do something so you have local access to that variable in that function. With classes, you don't have to do that. So I have a little bit of functions here set up, and I'll explain them as I go. But basically, the first one is more just a general get you to understand what's going on. When you are dealing with a class, there's a lot of these crazy looking things that go into it, but the only one you really need to worry about is this init one, and it's not a requirement. What it's here for is when I call the class, that gets ran. So if I want to do some prep before I do some other things, I could put some stuff in the init, I call the class, it'll take care of that, and then I could do something with the functions inside of the class, and that's already taken place. In this case, all I'm doing is just assigning class values to 0. And what makes it a class variable is this self right here. This self is talking about the class itself. Don't think too much about it. That's pretty much what it is. It's saying, this is me, and this is the variable of me. If I didn't do that, like for example here, then it's not going to be usable throughout like normal. And I'll show that happening. I'm not really using these other than the first one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this class, and it's going to do this initialization thing. And then I'm going to call this function right after. What you have to do when you're dealing with classes, it's a requirement to call the class, right? All these functions inside of it are locked behind the class. So you need to call the class and then the function, and that will get you into doing whatever it is that you needed to do. So what I have down at the bottom is an example of just a straight, I am calling the class, and you can see this looks just like as if I was calling a normal function, and then I'm putting a dot, and then I'm calling the function with the parens on both. What this is going to do is it's going to say call the main one, then it's going to call function 1. So function 1 right here is just iterating over a range, and it's basically taking a local variable value, and it's assigning a class variable that value, and then I'm printing it. So we'll see this 1 go up, but we'll even see it as the 0 when we first call it. All right, so it shows 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, so the reason why I did that, and hopefully you kind of can see why, is I'm printing var1, which is I set as 0. In a lot of cases, you are going to need to set values like that ahead of time, because if you don't, you're going to have an error that the variable hasn't been assigned yet, and you're trying to use an unassigned variable. So if that is the case, you could just assign it ahead of time, because you might be calling things differently, and so you could just put a null value there in place, and if you get a null value, you just know it hadn't been set yet, and you could disregard it or do whatever with you that you need to do. You just know that it hadn't been set, it's using some default value. But the reason why I did this is because I print the 0 as it was, then I iterate from 0 to 4, which is actually 3, right? So then 0, 1, 2, 3. So the first change, it just basically set it equal to itself. So that's fine. Another thing that I'm doing in this function is I'm just assigning variable 4 to this integer right here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I wanted to show you that you don't have to do everything in here. This is just gonna get called no matter what, so it's a very safe place to put it, but you don't have to make sure all the time that something is put up there, because nothing is necessarily using variable 4. If I later ask for it and it's not there, that could be a problem, but I can just know, well, I don't ask for it if I don't set it. So there's kind of a little bit of things like that. The next little piece I wanted to show you is what happens when I call 2 now. So 2 is going to print I, which I set it here, and then it's going to print variable 4, which was set inside of 1. So it's going to actually bark because of I, but I'm going to show you it doing that. Name I is not defined. Because I didn't put the self dot in front of I, it has no idea what this is. This is a local assignment, and this is dealing with a local assignment that hadn't been assigned, right? So let's just comment that out now so we could see variable 4. It would be the same case, except this one, it's going to work. Actually, hold on, I just remembered. I'm doing, before I even go crazy, I'm showing this not working either. So here we go. So it's saying main1 object has no attribute var4. The reason why this didn't work is because of the way that I'm calling them has a big flaw in it. And so I wanted to do this ahead of time, because normally you won't really call them this way. You can if you need to, or if it's like a one-time thing, but there's a better way to do it, and that's what I'm going to show you. What the power of a class is that when I call a class, I can assign this call to a variable, and then I can always go back to it. So whatever I do inside of that class is its own local thing that's going on, and I can check anything that I wanted to, what happened. And I can have another variable assignment to the same class with different inputs, and then I can carry that with me, and then I'll have 2 of these going around, both with different things. So it's not like it's overwriting anything. They're their own local copy. It's like going into like a portal. You're walking into a house, but when you open the door, you go into a different dimension, and everyone's going into the same house that's set up the same way, and when they move stuff, it's only moving it for them. So that's pretty much how that is. And the reason why this had a problem is because I am not storing the result of this right here. When I call it like this, I'm doing a brand new class call. And so one had never been called for this particular case. So I'm going to get more into how we get around that. And I kind of already started here on the next little thing. So what we want to do, instead of just doing main1, we could just assign it as a variable. So m equals, I'm saying main2 here. I think that's supposed to be, oh no, that's okay. I guess I'm moving on to the next one pretty quickly. So I'm assigning this class call main2 to m. Now, whenever I want to deal with anything in there, in the case of the first one, I could have done m.1, and then I could have called m.2, and that would have been usable. It would have not gave me that error. because I'm calling that same class where variable 4 had been set. So what I'm doing here is showing you an extra step that you can do where instead of just calling the class and having variables assigned, I am sending something into the class which will be processed in some way. So in main 2, I'm sending what I'm calling first name. And so when I call main 2, I put that in the class call inside of the parentheses for the class, and that value is getting sent in. This then gets checked, and what I'm doing here, just for the sake of it, is I'm checking to make sure that what I sent in was a string, and if it's not a string, raise an error saying it has to be a string. And so this doesn't really have anything to do with classes, it's more like error handling, but the reason why I'm doing this is I want to show you that it can be dangerous just sending random junk into a class without knowing exactly what this class is designed to do or be used for. So you should know what the class is used for, and you should send it the things that it expects, or else there could be some things going crazy. There might not be error handling in the class specifically. It all depends on how you wrote it, right? You might be error handling somewhere else. So I'm just going to call this, and it's pretty much you're just gonna see a basic error message that I put that said first name must be a string. So I'm raising a type error saying it's not what I expected it to be. I'm not gonna let you continue. But what I had tried to do was call the class and then call name length. So just like the one example up here, I'm calling the class and then I'm calling this function in the class. But because I'm sending in a value, I could use that value to do something with. So this function right here is going to give me the length of the name for whatever string I send in. Technically, it doesn't have to be a name, right? It could just be some random string. It doesn't know the difference. So I send in a string, and then if I call name length, it's going to tell me the length of how many letters are in it. So let me uncomment this. And one thing also to note, I'm doing it here as well, is that instead of just directly putting what I'm putting in the parentheses, I could make a variable here and then put that variable in here. So wherever the variable starts or wherever I'm sending in, it doesn't matter. Maybe I'm taking user input, I'm assigning that user input to a variable, then I'm taking that variable, sending it into the class, then whatever variable goes into the class, I'm assigning it to a class variable, and then I'm doing something with it. So the entire thing, no one knows what was sent in. We just know that whatever was sent in is going to get processed based off of the functions we made, and then something is going to return from it. So that's where classes are starting to show like their real use and like the strength of how you would want to use them to your advantage, right? So they're not when you write a class, you're writing kind of general case things that might be useful for you, and then you send in something and it sends it back out. You didn't have to go process what you sent in your brain. The class did it for you. Now you get it back and good to go. Now I can work with whatever I got and continue moving forward. So I'm just doing two things here. I'm doing that same thing where instead I'm putting an actual string in, Ricky, and then I'm calling name length. And you could see when I call the class from now on, I'm referring to the class as the variable because I am referring to that specific reference of the class. So I want to always refer to that going forward unless I want to start a new instance of the class because I'm going to send in a different first name. So that's what I'm doing here, and I'm actually assigning a return value. So if we look at name length, there's nothing printing here or doing anything. All it's going to do is return the length. That's it. And the ends with is going to do the same thing, but just I'm printing what I'm going to return when I return it. So I think I need to comment these out too. So you can print stuff in the class. You could return it, print it out. It doesn't really matter. They're both the same thing, right? Though usually with the class, a lot of the work that's happening in the class you're going to be using outside of that class. That class is just doing conversions or doing something for you, you get it back, and then you might send it to another class or do something with it, right? So you don't care that it doesn't need to print inside unless for some reason you wanted it to print, hey, I just processed the last name or something like that. So I'm going to call this, and what I'm doing is I'm taking the result of these class or function calls in that class instance, and I'm just basically making like a variable sentence out of it saying, the first name is this long, and the first name ends with this letter. So this, I hope, shows you that when you're using the variables, it doesn't really matter what you send in and what you get back. You're just going to work with whatever that is, as long as it's a valid type. Let me comment this out. So I see the Y here, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm calling both of these first, and then at the end I'm printing the results of both. But why printed first? Because I'm actually printing that inside here. So I was like, oh, why? And I didn't make like a whole sentence of it. I just made what it was. So I printed when I called ends with, this goes and does it. So if the print's in there, it's going to print. And then it returned the value here, and now I have that value too. So you can have it do something in there and return a value and then do something different with it back if you needed to do that. And then I print out these two things right here. So moving on, I'm going to show you essentially the same thing, but it's just to go a little bit more into how you can make this dynamic. So instead of doing this thing, I am making a list of names, and then I'm going to send each name in that list into it and then have it spit it out. And it's going to be the same exact result, except you'll see that the actual outputs are going to be dynamic in whatever was sent in. And I could have these in different orders. I can have 1,000 names. I can have a whole bunch of names. It doesn't matter. And it's just going to go do it for me. So maybe I have a, some document that has like people's names and addresses in it, and I need to process it in some way. Well, I send stuff in, it handles it, and it shoots it back out, and then, or whatever, right? So all of those are formatted the same, so the class should apply to all of those, and whatever needs to be done gets done. It tells you it's now done, and you have whatever usable information from that you got. Or maybe it'll tell you if there's formatting errors or something like that because you're missing someone's phone number. Like one of the functions could be check to see if their phone number's on file. If not, let me know so we can go figure out what their phone number is, or something like that. Okay, so, here is the output of that, and it's exactly the same, right? Just twice, and it's showing Ricky and Rebecca separately. So we see the Y because Ricky ends with the Y. It's printing that stuff out. Then we see the A because Rebecca ends with an A, and then it's printing that stuff out. And the class doesn't care, or nothing cares. It just knew it got something. It knows it needs to do something with it, and then it does that thing with it and does what you told it to do and gives it back out. The only time there would be an error, like I said before, is if I'm sending in like an integer or something that it's not expecting, and it's like the operation you're doing doesn't work on this or something like that. But if you had error handling in there, that's fine. It'll catch that you did something messed up, and it'll continue or give you a error or something. You can work with it to make it continue without causing like a fatal issue. Because maybe you're getting a list of things and you don't know how accurate everything is. Maybe someone did screw something up, and you don't want it to just break when you start sending it into this class. Let's see what I'm doing here. I think the next piece this is all the last piece for the most part. And what I'm going to show here is to take it a step further, because I'm moving that instance of that class around, right? So Ricky and Rebecca both have their own separate class. Technically, in this case, I'm overwriting it because I'm setting them both to M. So when Rebecca ran, M became Rebecca now, and now I don't have access to Ricky. But if I set them separately, then I would always have those with me, right? Like I can add that reference to a list, and then for all of them in the list, I could figure out what I needed or something. So what the next part is using that reference and kind of simulating what would happen if I changed something. Maybe I didn't have information initially, but now I do, and I want to go change something. And so I'm going to do that. And it needs to be able to handle that, but then also going forward, it needs to always reflect that change. So anything past needs to reflect the new change, and anything future. So what I'm doing here is I have the same identical thing that I had up top, but what I'm doing is I wrote a separate function right here that's called add last name. And all it's going to do is take in a last name, and then it's going to append it to the first name. And so this shows two things. First, it shows that I can send variables into the functions, no big deal. I'm not required to send everything to this initialization. I can send what I need, like the first name is always going to be there, but maybe I don't have everyone's last name, so I don't, and I have a function here that if I get the last name, I can send it in, and then that will process, and then it will do their thing. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm taking the last name, and I'm not assigning the last name as a value, which I could have done. I could have said self.lastname equals whatever the last name is, and that would then make it always there. I'm actually just doing full name. So now instead of referring to the person as just the first name, it's going to refer to them as both. But technically not, because full name and first name are they're different variables. I still have access to the first name, and now I have access to the full name. And even, let's do this while I'm here. Let's just do all of it. So I'm going to just assign last name to this. And let's take it, okay, I'm actually going to even go a step further than I think about this. I'm going to set, self.lastname is going to equal null. It doesn't like that. Oh, you can't really do that. Whatever. Let's do 0. So, what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to, before I call last name and do full name, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to try to print the last name, and we're going to see what happens. Last name equals and last name. Actually, we could just print this like directly. So let me comment these out. I'm going to run this all again, and I'm going to try to print last name. See, last name printed just fine, right? But it's a 0. Because I set it ahead of time, it's fine. It's like, okay, whatever, no big deal. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm actually referencing the variable directly. I'm not doing a parenthesis. I'm not calling a function. I am referencing the variable directly through the class. So now m.lastname is referring to Ricky's last name, because Ricky is the person I sent into the class who is assigned the variable m. So what I could probably do here is go, if I get a 0, or if m.lastname is 0, then, you know, disregard it because the last name isn't set, or something like that, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to call the full name. So I'm going to get a return of full name, and then I'm going to send in the last name into add last name, which already has that reference m, right? So I set full name, which is the return, to whatever I got back, and I said print it. And as we could see, it printed Ricky Rickieson. Now, if I wanted to, I don't have to do a return on that, right? It's very similar, pretty much, it's an identical process to what I did with last name. Instead of returning from that, since I still have that class object, I could just do m.fullname, which is what I'm going to do right here. And you'll see it's going to, so I did underscore. You're going to see that it'll print it twice, right? So these are both identical, but you don't really need to necessarily return everything, because now I'm starting to build a profile around Ricky, what his last name is, maybe I have his address on file, there's all these things I have, and I don't necessarily know what I have. So maybe I want to go, oh, I want Ricky's, like I'm just doing a check. I'm like, give me Ricky's address, m.address. I get back 0. I'm like, oh, I don't have his address. I don't want it to like return me address when I set it or anything like that, because I'm not using it right now. I'm going to use it way later. And since I have the class reference, whenever I need to refer to it, I can. As long as, remember, you would want to set address up here first, because if it wasn't set and you didn't have it, then it's going to bark at you because that doesn't exist as an attribute of the class. So let me now just go and print one more time m.lastname, and you'll see that this is gonna actually be changed. Even though they're identical in how they look, because I'm going in and changing it in the class, this is just talking or looking for that, whatever that happens to equal in the class. And since it's a new thing now, it's gonna print the new thing. So there we go. So I printed 0 initially, then I went and set it. And so now we have access to the full name, but we also have access to the new last name, which is now Rickieson. So, you know, I didn't return last name. I just set it quietly in there. In the future, I want to see, do I have his last name? Give me m.lastname. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. It'll let me know whether I should be making more of this stuff or not. Also, in the description, I'll have some links to things like my Twitch channel where I program live, as well as do network security stuff, pen testing, things like that, my notify.me, and any information related to like the operating system I use, text editor, and all that good stuff. Take it easy.